June 28, 1944, just outside St. Lo, Normandy. The battlefield is silent now, except for the faint hiss of burning metal. Charred Sherman tanks lie scattered across the hedgerows, their turrets blown open, black smoke curling into the gray French sky. German officers stand on a ridge, scanning the wreckage through binoculars. To them, it's proof of another American failure. Clumsy armor, no match for the precision of the Panther or the deadly 88. But as the night deepens, faint lights flicker in the valley below. At first, the Germans think it's a recovery team, maybe a few trucks. By dawn, the hum of engines fills the air. Bulldozers move in. Mechanics swarm over the wrecks, cutting, welding, refitting. One tank after another is hauled upright, patched, fueled, and rearmed. By the next morning, the same Shermans the Germans had written off are rolling forward again, engines growling, guns ready. From the enemy's perspective, it looked impossible. From the American side, it was routine. Because behind every battlefront in Europe, there existed another army, silent, tireless and armed not with rifles but with wrenches, cables, and the will to keep the war machine alive. By the middle of the Second World War, tank warfare had become the steel heartbeat of the modern battlefield. From the deserts of North Africa to the muddy plains of Russia, armored divisions were the spearheads of victory, or the symbols of defeat. But behind every tank that moved forward was a silent truth. These machines were fragile. They broke, burned, and bled oil faster than soldiers could reload. In 1942, the German Wehrmacht still believed its engineering supremacy could outmatch any enemy. Their tanks, the Panzer IV, the Panther, and the Tiger, were marvels of design, precise, lethal, and terrifying. But they were also over-engineered, requiring specialized parts and long repair cycles. A single mechanical fault could sideline a Tiger for days. Across the ocean, the Americans took a different path. Their approach wasn't to build perfection, it was to build endurance. The U.S. Army's M4 Sherman wasn't the best tank on paper. It wasn't the thickest, the fastest, or the most powerful, but it was reliable, easy to produce, and crucially, easy to repair. Every bolt, bearing, and tread link could be replaced in the field, often within hours. Still, reliability alone wasn't enough. When America entered the war in December 1941, its armored forces were young and untested. In North Africa, the first real test came at Kasserine Pass in February 1943. The defeat there exposed not only tactical weakness but also a critical, logistical gap, the inability to recover and repair damaged tanks fast enough. Wrecks littered the Tunisian hills for weeks. Crews waited for spare parts that never came. Commanders realized then, winning battles would require more than bravery or firepower. It would demand a system that could bring broken machines back to life faster than the enemy could destroy them. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department took this lesson seriously. Under its guidance, new doctrines were born. Doctrines that treated maintenance and repair as weapons themselves. Entire units were formed not to fight but to fix. Recovery vehicles were developed specifically to haul crippled tanks from under fire. Field repair depots were designed to follow the front line, sometimes moving daily with the advancing armies. This philosophy of mobility, modularity, and manpower was distinctly American. It drew on the industrial heart of the United States, Detroit's mass production mentality, Chicago's mechanical expertise, and a logistics network unlike any the world had ever seen. Trains, ships, and convoys carried not only tanks but also spare engines, transmissions, and even prefabricated hull sections. Each armored division deployed with its own maintenance battalion, composed of hundreds of trained technicians, welders, and recovery crews. They carried portable workshops, forges, and welding rigs mounted on trucks. A damaged Sherman didn't need to be sent back to England or even Paris. It could often be rebuilt right beside the front line, under camouflage nets in the shadow of battle. To the German High Command, this was an alien concept. Their repair philosophy had been born in a pre-industrial mindset, one of craftsmanship and precision. Panzer divisions depended on central workshops miles behind the front, and spare parts that were often unavailable. Even a simple mechanical issue could immobilize a German tank column for days, giving the Americans precious time to regroup and strike again. By contrast, American doctrine turned every setback into a cycle of renewal. A tank hit today could be back in combat tomorrow. Each recovery meant not just one more machine on the battlefield, but one more crew that didn't have to be reassigned or lost. The system multiplied strength, quietly, efficiently, invisibly. As the war rolled toward Europe in 1944, this invisible army of repairmen grew stronger. They would soon face their greatest test, in the hedgerows of Normandy where mud, mines, and relentless combat threatened to tear apart the Allied advance before it truly began. But this time, the Americans were ready. Their tanks would fall, burn, and rise again. Because in the war of machines, victory didn't belong to those who built the best tank. It belonged to those who could bring it back to life again and again. When Allied forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, they brought with them not just the greatest invasion force in history, but the most sophisticated repair and recovery infrastructure ever assembled for war. Behind every armored division that rolled onto French soil, there was an entire ecosystem designed to keep it alive. The U.S. Army's logistical blueprint had evolved from years of hard lessons. In North Africa, commanders realized that traditional depot systems, static, centralized, and slow, couldn't keep pace with mobile warfare. So they created a tiered repair system. The first tier was the unit-level maintenance teams that traveled directly with the tank companies. These men could patch up bullet holes, replace tracks, weld armor, or swap out engines right on the battlefield. If the damage was too severe, recovery units stepped in, using specialized vehicles like the M32 tank recovery vehicle or the massive M26 Dragon Wagon to tow crippled tanks from the front. The second tier was the field repair depots, positioned just a few miles behind the line. These were sprawling workshops of canvas tents and makeshift hangars, where dozens of mechanics worked around the clock under floodlights. Engines were stripped and rebuilt, hulls straightened, transmissions replaced. The atmosphere was industrial, sparks flying, generators roaring, the rhythmic clang of hammers echoing through the night. These depots could rebuild a tank in 48 hours, sometimes faster. The third tier, known as base ordnance depots, stretched back through liberated France into England. Here, tanks too heavily damaged for field repair were completely overhauled. Some were even cannibalized, stripped for parts to keep others running. The U.S. Army's massive supply network ensured that replacement engines, guns, and transmissions were always on hand. By late 1944, spare parts were being flown in by C-47 transport planes, or trucked in on the famous Red Ball Express, the high-speed convoy system that kept the Allied war machine fed, fueled, and repaired. This vast logistical machine was sustained by something even more powerful than technology: organization. The Ordnance Corps structure was built on efficiency and delegation. Every armored division had its Ordnance Maintenance Battalion, subdivided into companies specialized in different forms of repair: armament, automotive, recovery, and supply. Each of these units operated semi-independently, capable of deploying wherever they were needed. It was a mobile, self-healing system, a concept foreign to the rigid German command structure. The Wehrmacht relied on fewer centralized maintenance units that required long transport routes and complex coordination. In theory, it worked. In practice, it collapsed under the sheer chaos of modern warfare. The Americans, on the other hand, embraced flexibility. A Sherman could lose its engine in the morning, be recovered by noon, and have a new power plant installed before nightfall. Many repair crews operated under fire, using wrecked tanks as cover while welding or refitting damaged ones. Reports from Normandy describe ordnance teams working in knee-deep mud, patching armor with steel plates scavenged from destroyed vehicles, often improvising tools or components when official parts were unavailable. This repair philosophy extended to the soldiers themselves. Every tank crew was trained not just to fight, but to maintain their machines. Crews learned to replace tracks, clear clogged guns, and perform emergency engine repairs. This self-reliance meant that even in the chaos of combat, a damaged Sherman might limp back into action without ever leaving the battlefield. The result was staggering. By August 1944, as Allied forces broke out of Normandy, reports from the U.S. First Army showed that over 80% of damaged tanks were returned to service, a recovery rate unprecedented in modern warfare. German intelligence began taking notice. Field reports from panzer divisions mentioned seeing previously destroyed American tanks returning to battle within days. One frustrated German commander wrote, We destroy them by the dozens, yet they return as if from the earth itself. It wasn't magic. It was organization, the kind that turned industry into strategy. While German commanders obsessed over perfecting the Tiger or Panther, the Americans perfected something else entirely, the ability to never run out of tanks. For every Panther that broke down and sat idle, 3 Shermans rolled forward, some repaired, some rebuilt, all fighting. As autumn approached, this invisible war, the war of repair and recovery, became as vital as the battles themselves. For in the fields of Normandy and beyond, the outcome wasn't decided solely by who destroyed more tanks, but by who could bring them back to life faster. And soon, as the Allies pushed toward Paris and beyond, the German High Command would witness something they had never imagined possible, a military machine that simply refused to stay broken. War is often remembered for its generals and its victories, but the story of America's unstoppable tank recovery system is really the story of people, men who fought with hammers, not rifles, who worked in the mud instead of command tents, who fought not to destroy but to rebuild. The human angle, the mechanics of war in the chaos of Normandy, the line between soldier and mechanic blurred. Ordnance crews lived within earshot of the guns, sleeping beside piles of broken steel and waking to the sound of engines coughing back to life. Their job never stopped. Each dawn brought new wrecks, each night brought new repairs. Many of these men weren't trained warriors, they were welders, machinists, engineers, and farmers from the American Midwest, suddenly thrown into the most industrial war in history. They worked under fire, often in the open. German artillery rarely distinguished between tanks and the men fixing them. One U.S. Army report from July 1944 described a maintenance crew near St. Lo repairing a Sherman under constant mortar fire. They refused to stop, and when the repair was done, the tank rejoined the battle that same afternoon. What made these men remarkable wasn't just their technical skill. It was their endurance. They worked 18-hour shifts in mud that could swallow boots whole, using salvaged steel and scavenged parts when supply trucks ran late. They welded armor plates torn from destroyed tanks onto new ones, patched holes with boilerplate, and cut spare treads by hand. To them, the job was simple. Every tank back in service meant more infantry saved, more ground gained. Their motivation wasn't glory, it was duty, and the quiet pride of knowing that every working machine might turn the tide for the men up front. One mechanic recalled years later, "We didn't think about medals. We thought about getting that tank back out there before morning." And often, they did. The technological angle, tools of resurrection. To make this miracle of recovery possible, the U.S. Army relied on machines built for one purpose, saving other machines. The most iconic was the M32 tank recovery vehicle, a heavily modified Sherman chassis fitted with a powerful winch, an A-frame crane, and a dozer blade. It could haul damaged tanks from the front lines, tow them to safety, and even perform field lifts for engine replacements. It was followed by the M26 Dragon Wagon, a 40-ton armored tractor-trailer designed to carry disabled tanks back to depots at high speed. These vehicles became the backbone of the American recovery effort, forming convoys that worked day and night across Europe's shattered roads. The technology behind these machines reflected the same principles that made American industry powerful: adaptability and modularity. Every recovery vehicle shared parts with the tanks it rescued, making maintenance simple and logistics smooth. Field mechanics carried standardized toolkits that could be used on almost any vehicle, from a light Stuart to a Sherman. But perhaps the most revolutionary tool wasn't mechanical at all. It was organization. The U.S. Army's maintenance flow chart, developed by the Ordnance Department, dictated that every tank should pass through clearly defined repair stages, from field recovery to light maintenance, then heavy repair, and finally reissue. Each stage had maximum time limits: 24 hours for minor fixes, 72 hours for major rebuilds. The goal wasn't just repair, it was tempo. In contrast, the German army had no such unified system. Each panzer division operated differently, and parts shortages constantly plagued frontline units. Many Panthers were abandoned simply because they couldn't be recovered in time, not because they were destroyed, but because the Wehrmacht lacked the vehicles and manpower to tow them away. The Americans, meanwhile, turned even destruction into supply. Wrecked Shermans were stripped for usable engines, guns, and armor. Nothing was wasted. Reports from the Ordnance Department show that by late 1944, nearly 30% of all spare parts in France came from salvaged wrecks. The battlefield itself became a supply chain. This combination of technology, planning, and sheer human will gave the U.S. Army something no other army possessed: momentum. The tactical angle, the power of speed was everything in modern warfare. A tank destroyed today could change tomorrow's battle if it was back in action. The Germans quickly realized this. In Normandy, they watched with disbelief as American armored units that had been decimated one day reappeared seemingly at full strength the next. Field intelligence reports from Panzer Lehr Division noted, enemy tank strength remains inexplicably constant despite losses. That inexplicable consistency was the result of a battlefield doctrine built on immediate recovery. American commanders insisted that no tank be left behind unless absolutely impossible. When a Sherman was hit, the crew marked its position on their maps. Within hours, recovery teams moved in, sometimes under artillery or sniper fire to drag the vehicle out. Once repaired, it returned directly to its unit, not weeks later but often within a single day. This practice had a profound tactical effect. German commanders often miscalculated Allied strength, assuming that tank losses would weaken American armored pushes. Instead, they faced near-identical numbers day after day. It also shaped morale. Crews knew that if their tank was hit, it wouldn't be abandoned. Recovery meant survival, for the machine and often for them. Tankers trusted their mechanics as much as their commanders. Colonel H. L. Pugh of the U.S. Ordnance Corps summarized it best in his 1945 report. The enemy could destroy our tanks. He could not destroy our ability to rebuild them. From human endurance to mechanical ingenuity, the Americans had transformed repair into warfare itself. But the true depth of this system, and its psychological impact on the enemy, would only become clear as the war pressed deeper into Europe, because the Germans soon realized they weren't fighting a single army of men. They were fighting a self-sustaining machine that refused to stop. The enemy's perspective: shock and disbelief. By late summer of 1944, German commanders along the Western Front were growing increasingly frustrated. They had expected the Allied advance to slow under the weight of attrition, the natural exhaustion of men and machines. Yet, to their astonishment, the opposite seemed true. Every time American armor appeared to falter, it surged back with renewed strength. At first, Wehrmacht intelligence officers assumed the Allies were receiving constant reinforcements from England. But prisoner interrogations and aerial reconnaissance revealed a different truth. The same divisions, the same units, fighting again and again with tanks that should have been written off. Reports from Panzergruppe West began noting strange observations. Tanks destroyed one day were being identified again days later, their unit markings unchanged. A German officer from the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, reportedly remarked, "The Americans repair their tanks as if they breed them." To the Germans, this bordered on the impossible. Their own recovery units were overstretched and undersupplied. A damaged Panther could take a week or more to fix, if it could even be recovered at all. Panthers and Tigers were powerful but delicate. Transmissions failed, engines overheated, and spare parts were often stuck hundreds of kilometers away. In comparison, the Americans seemed to possess an endless reservoir of mobility. Captured documents later showed German analysts trying to calculate how such rapid repair cycles were even logistically possible. The conclusion stunned them. The U.S. Army had integrated repair into its combat strategy itself. It wasn't a support function, and it was a weapon. The shock went beyond logistics. On the battlefield, German tank crews felt the psychological toll. They might destroy 5 or 6 Shermans in a day, only to see what looked like the same formation return by sunrise. Some began to doubt their own reports, wondering if Allied numbers were far greater than believed. In truth, they were facing the same tanks, resurrected overnight by the tireless American Maintenance Corps. This sense of futility slowly eroded the myth of German mechanical dominance. What good was a Panther's 75mm gun if it could not return to battle once disabled? The Allies, with their seemingly endless ability to repair and replace, had turned persistence into strategy. The strategic angle, logistics as a weapon, At the highest levels of Allied command, this ability to sustain armor wasn't a byproduct. It was the foundation of operational success. General Dwight D. Eisenhower often emphasized that wars were won not by brilliant tactics, but by the system that keeps the army moving. His staff understood that speed of repair meant continuity of momentum, and momentum was the heartbeat of the Allied advance across France. When the breakout from Normandy began with Operation Cobra in late July 1944, tank losses were high. Hedgerows, hidden anti-tank guns, and panzer ambushes took their toll. Yet within days, units like the U.S. 2nd Armored Division were back to full operational strength. Out of 140 tanks damaged or destroyed during the first 3 days of Cobra, more than 90 were repaired and returned to combat within a week. That speed of regeneration gave the Allies what military theorists would later call operational depth, the ability to absorb damage without losing tempo. German forces, on the other hand, lacked this depth. When a panzer regiment lost tanks, those machines often remained lost. Without replacements or repairs, each engagement permanently reduced their fighting power. It was a slow bleed, invisible but fatal. American logistics transformed the nature of attrition itself. Traditional military theory assumed that whoever suffered greater material losses would weaken first. But in 1944, the Americans inverted that rule. Their repair and recovery systems effectively recycled combat power faster than it could be destroyed. This logistical superiority extended beyond the battlefield. Massive repair depots, such as the Sand Section Ordnance depots established after the liberation of Paris, processed thousands of damaged vehicles every month. Some tanks cycled through multiple repairs, returning to Battle 3 even 4 times before the war ended. Every tank saved meant one fewer needed from U.S. factories, conserving resources and shipping space. The result was a strategic self-reinforcement loop. The more battles fought, the more experienced the repair units became, and the faster they operated. By autumn 1944, some ordnance battalions were completing full engine replacements in under 6 hours, even in freezing rain or under enemy shell fire. The moral angle, the spirit of recovery at its core, the American repair system reflected a deeper cultural mindset, one of pragmatism, adaptability, and relentless optimism. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of the German military, the U.S. Army encouraged initiative at every level. Mechanics were empowered to improvise, commanders were taught to trust their maintenance crews, and logistics officers were trained to solve problems on the move. This flexibility created a battlefield culture where breakdowns weren't failures, they were challenges to overcome. There was also an emotional element. Tank crews developed strong bonds with the men who repaired their machines. These weren't faceless technicians. They were brothers in the same campaign. Many maintenance soldiers painted their unit insignias or signatures on repaired tanks, knowing exactly which machines they had saved. This human connection turned repair into a form of morale. Soldiers knew that even if their tank was hit, it wasn't gone forever. That faith in their comrades, in their system, in their nation's industrial power, became a quiet source of strength. As General George S. Patton famously said, "Wars may be fought with weapons, but they are won by men." For the United States Army, those men included the ones who never fired a shot, yet whose hands decided whether victory rolled forward or stood still. And as 1944 drew to a close, that combination of spirit, system, and steel would face its ultimate test. The winter ahead would bring chaos, cold, and one of the most desperate German offensives of the entire war. But even as the Ardennes froze and the front collapsed into confusion, one thing would remain constant: the Americans' unbreakable rhythm of repair. Normandy, July 1944. The landscape was no longer green. It was churned to brown mud and blackened wreckage. Tank battles had become daily rituals of destruction. Shermans advanced through narrow hedgerows where every turn might conceal a German 88mm gun. Each explosion scattered steel and flesh in equal measure. But while the battlefield seemed a graveyard of machines, behind the front another kind of battle raged. One fought not with guns, but with grit and grease. The U.S. First Army's maintenance battalions had turned fields and orchards into industrial cities. In the days following Operation Cobra, hundreds of tanks limped or were towed into these makeshift depots. Tracks clanked. Welding torches hissed. Generators droned through the night. There was no pause, no shift change, no rest. The goal was clear: get every tank back into the fight. Corporal James W. Cutter, a mechanic with the 702nd Ordnance Company, recalled later in an interview, "We worked like surgeons under fire. Every tank that came in was a patient that couldn't die." His team rebuilt 3 Shermans in 24 hours. One had its entire turret replaced using a crane, improvised from a broken telephone pole. The recovery units, the unseen lifeline of armored warfare, became heroes in their own right. The M32 recovery vehicles and M26 Dragon wagons thundered through the combat zones, dragging crippled tanks from the front line under enemy fire. They often drove straight into artillery zones, their crews braving sniper fire just to reach a wounded machine. One after-action report noted that during the Normandy breakout, a recovery crew from the 3rd Armored Division rescued over 20 tanks in a single night. Their reward? A few hours of sleep and then back to the line again. This relentless cycle created a strange rhythm to battle, a rhythm the Germans couldn't comprehend. On July 27th, German panzer commanders reported that the same American armored formations destroyed near St. Lo had reappeared on the offensive. What they didn't realize was that the tanks weren't new. They were the same vehicles, refitted, repainted, reborn. The ability to regenerate fighting power overnight gave the Allies a staggering psychological edge. American armored divisions that should have been depleted instead maintained, and even increased, their operational strength. Units like the 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels, and 4th Armored Division spearheaded the breakout across France, their numbers seemingly immune to destruction. At the tactical level, this created chaos in German intelligence. Commanders like General Fritz Bayerlein of the Panzer Lehr Division struggled to explain the phenomenon. His units were losing tanks faster than they could repair them, while the Americans appeared to have endless reserves. In reality, both sides suffered mechanical and combat losses, but only one side could recover from them fast enough to matter. By early August, as the breakout from Normandy accelerated, the U.S. Army's repair and recovery system reached its most efficient phase. Mobile repair shops moved forward daily with the advancing troops. Engineers disassembled entire tanks under orchard trees, using salvaged cranes and welding rigs running off Jeep engines. In some areas, repaired tanks were rolling out within 12 hours of being recovered. It was this tempo, this unbroken cycle of destruction and renewal, that shattered the balance of attrition. The Germans could win individual battles, but they could not win the war of endurance. Every Panther knocked out cost them precious time and resources. Every Sherman lost was simply reborn. The turning point wasn't a single battle. It was the realization that the American system had outpaced German strategy. Attrition, once Germany's weapon of choice, now worked against them. Even the terrain, which had initially favored the defenders, turned into an advantage for the repair crews. The hedgerows concealed mobile workshops, shielding them from Luftwaffe reconnaissance. While German repair columns were bombed or cut off, American mechanics worked unseen, night after night. A report from the U.S. 12th Army Group dated August 1944 recorded an extraordinary statistic. More than 80% of damaged tanks were being returned to service within 72 hours. It was a number unheard of in any army up to that point. The Wehrmacht's mechanical elite, once the envy of the world, now faced a nightmare. They could destroy tanks, but they could not destroy time, and time belonged to the Americans. By the end of the Normandy campaign, the German front was collapsing. The American armor that surged toward Paris wasn't just the product of Detroit's factories. It was the product of battlefield resurrection. Every weld, every patch, every night spent in the mud had transformed the tide of war. What began as a desperate attempt to keep tanks running had become one of the greatest strategic advantages of the Allied campaign. But the true test of the system, its breaking point, was still to come. As winter descended over Europe, the German army prepared a final counterstrike. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the limits of American resilience would be pushed further than ever before. And once again, the war would hinge not only on who could fight, but on who could rebuild. December 1944, the Ardennes forest. Snow blanketed the hills of Belgium in a deceptive calm. The air was bitter, the ground frozen hard as iron. Then, before dawn on December 16th, the silence shattered. The German army launched its last great offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. It was chaos. The Wehrmacht surged forward through fog and snow, striking the thinly held American lines with overwhelming force. Hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles were thrown into the counterattack, and within days, American units were cut off or surrounded. Roads clogged with wrecked vehicles, frozen fuel lines, and shattered bridges. The winter that year was among the harshest in decades, and for the ordnance and maintenance battalions, the lifeblood of the Allied armor, it became a nightmare. Engines froze solid. Oil thickened into sludge. Steel cracked under the cold. Tanks that weren't destroyed by the enemy simply froze to death. For a moment, it seemed that even the Americans' legendary repair system had met its match. But then, as they had done since Normandy, the mechanics began to fight back. The battle behind the battle. When the front lines collapsed, the recovery teams didn't retreat. They adapted. Ordnance crews of the 3rd Armored Division and 7th Armored Division began operating in near frontline conditions, often within earshot of German tanks. They used every scrap of ingenuity to keep their machines alive. Fires were lit under tank engines to thaw frozen oil. Carburetors were disassembled with bare, frost-bitten hands. Mechanics cannibalized destroyed vehicles under moonlight, scavenging transmissions, guns, and engines in -20 temperatures. A report from the headquarters 1st U.S. Army Ordnance Section, dated December 23rd, noted, "Despite extreme conditions, maintenance operations continue at 70% efficiency. Improvised recovery procedures are being used where equipment cannot function due to cold." Improvised was an understatement. In one account, a recovery unit near St. Vith lacked proper towing cables, so they used lengths of telephone wire twisted together to pull a 30-ton Sherman from a ditch. Another crew thawed a frozen Zyak gearbox by pouring hot coffee into it, then drove the tank 5 miles back to the repair point. Even under bombardment, the rhythm of recovery persisted. When the town of Bastogne was surrounded, elements of the 10th Armored Division's ordnance unit stayed inside the perimeter. They set up a repair yard in a church courtyard, working, through artillery barrages, mending tanks with parts stripped from wrecks outside the lines. By the time the siege lifted, 28 tanks had been restored to service, the difference between holding and losing the town. German perception. They do not stop. The German High Command once again found itself in disbelief. Field reports from the 5th Panzer Army complained that American tank strength reappears undiminished, despite the harsh conditions. One frustrated officer wrote, "Our men freeze, our machines fail, yet the Americans continue as though the weather is theirs." That perception wasn't far from the truth. The American logistical chain, though stretched thin, never fully broke. The Red Ball Express convoys, many driven by African American soldiers, fought through snow and ambush to deliver fuel, spare parts, and recovery equipment to the front. In their wake, the ordnance battalions worked miracles. German commanders, accustomed to the fragility of their own armored divisions, could not comprehend how quickly the Allies restored their machines. In reality, the Americans were waging a second silent war, one of repair and replacement, running parallel to every battle. By January 1945, the effects were unmistakable. In the first 10 days of the Bulge, the U.S. Army recorded nearly 1,600 armored vehicles disabled, but over 2,200 were repaired and returned to service before the end of the month. The Germans had achieved tactical surprise but not strategic impact. Their own tank losses, unrepaired and unreplaced, left their spearheads exhausted long before the offensive could reach its goals. Repair as resistance. For many ordnance soldiers, the Ardennes was less about mechanics and more about endurance. Working in sub-zero temperatures, often without proper winter gear, they improvised shelters from tank hulls and tarps. The clang of hammers and the crackle of welders echoed through the frozen forest. They called it the sound of defiance. Private Charles Taylor, a mechanic from the 9th Armored Division, later wrote in his diary, We fixed tanks until our fingers bled and froze, until our breath turned to ice on the steel. Every one that moved again meant another day the line held. Their work gave the armored divisions their backbone. When Patton's Third Army swung north in its dramatic relief of Bastogne, much of its armor consisted of tanks that had been damaged only days before. The repair units had resurrected an army from the snow. By the time the offensive collapsed in late January, German hopes of breaking the Allied front had evaporated. They had gambled everything, their fuel, their reserves, their last operational tanks, and lost them to a machine that refused to stop moving. The Americans' ability to recover and repair armor under such extreme conditions didn't just sustain the front, it broke the enemy's will. The Wehrmacht had counted on exhaustion and paralysis to slow their foes. Instead, they encountered a system that turned even disaster into momentum. When the snow finally melted, the roads of the Ardennes were lined with the rusting hulks of German armor. Tigers and Panthers stood silent, too complex to repair, too heavy to recover. Nearby, American mechanics were already back to work, washing mud from their Shermans, replacing worn treads, preparing for the next push. The battle for the Ardennes had proven something profound. American power didn't just lie in its factories or its numbers. It lay in its capacity to recover, to rebuild, to adapt, faster and better than anyone else. From the frozen forests of Belgium to the final push across the Rhine, the rhythm of repair would continue to define the Allied advance. Because by the winter of 1945, even German commanders understood the truth. You could destroy an American tank, but not the system that kept it alive. When the snows of the Ardennes finally began to thaw in early 1945, the magnitude of what had just occurred became clear. The German counteroffensive, once heralded as Hitler's last masterstroke, had failed catastrophically. Yet among the endless columns of wreckage littering the Belgian forests and Luxembourg hills, one truth stood out starkly to every observer. The American Army's machines, which the Germans had expected to crush, were once again advancing. The Allied repair and recovery network had done more than just fix tanks. It had sustained the very heartbeat of the war effort. By February 1945, U.S. ordnance units across the European theater had restored over 80% of damaged tanks to full service, a figure unmatched by any army in history up to that point. In contrast, the Wehrmacht's ability to repair its own armor had collapsed entirely. Fuel shortages, Allied bombing, and the loss of territory had strangled Germany's logistical veins. Even when workshops had the skill to repair a Tiger or Panther, they lacked the parts, the power, or the transport to move them. Entire armored divisions were left with only a handful of working tanks. The once feared panzer divisions, the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, had been reduced to static formations, their steel beasts rusting in barns and forests, waiting for spare parts that would never come. The numbers behind victory by war's end. U.S. ordnance units in Europe had performed over 16 million repairs, everything from bullet holes in fenders to complete engine rebuilds. Of these, more than 150,000 were tank or armored vehicle repairs, a scale that stunned post-war analysts. To put it into perspective, in a typical division, nearly 1 in every 10 soldiers was tied to maintenance or logistics in some form. Mechanics, drivers, welders, machinists, and engineers. The rear was not a place of rest. It was an unbroken chain of activity, stretching from the beaches of Normandy to the banks of the Rhine. What the Germans never fully grasped was that the American war machine was not built merely to fight. It was built to endure. A tank destroyed on Monday could be rolling back into battle by Thursday. A column halted by mechanical failure could be moving again before dawn. The entire Allied advance depended on this rhythm, destruction and renewal, loss and recovery, repeating endlessly until the Reich itself broke apart. A shift in warfare philosophy. The aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge marked a turning point in how military leaders viewed logistics and recovery. The lessons learned from the Ordnance Network would become the foundation for post-war mechanized doctrine. General Omar Bradley later wrote in his memoirs, "Our tanks and guns won the battle, but it was the wrenches and welders that won the." Or commanders across Europe realized that victory didn't belong solely to those who fought at the front, but to those who ensured the front could keep fighting. In Germany, Captured officers interviewed after the war consistently pointed to the same mystery. How, they asked, could the Americans lose so many tanks and yet always have more? The answer was simple, but devastating in its implications. They never stopped repairing. Behind every armored battalion stood a network of workshops, recovery crews, and spare parts depots that could resurrect an army overnight. It was a logistical organism the Germans could neither match nor destroy. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, this machine was operating at its peak efficiency. Even with bridges collapsing and enemy resistance hardening, the U.S. repair network rebuilt what was lost faster than the Germans could inflict damage. The system that had begun in the mud of Normandy, with a handful of field welders and recovery trucks, had evolved into an unstoppable industrial chain. The German generals, who once dismissed American armor as inferior, now faced a sobering reality. It was not the Sherman's gun, armor, or speed that made it deadly. It was its immortality, its ability to return again and again, no matter how many times it was knocked down. From the hedgerows of France to the frozen forests of Belgium, this relentless cycle of repair had transformed the course of the war. And now, as Allied forces prepared to strike deep into the heart of Germany, the same system was already at work, repairing, refueling, rebuilding, preparing for the final push that would end the conflict once and for all. As Allied forces advanced into Germany in the spring of 1945, the full consequences of the Americans' repair and recovery system became undeniable. Entire German cities lay in ruins, their industry crippled, their armored forces decimated, and yet the U.S. Army continued its relentless march. Behind every line of advancing Shermans and medium tanks, ordnance units worked tirelessly, ensuring that no vehicle remained idle longer than necessary. The logistical efficiency of the U.S. Army had become a force multiplier. Units damaged in one engagement could be restored and redeployed faster than the Germans could replace theirs. In many cases, tanks that had been written off during the Battle of the Bulge were participating in the push into the Ruhr and crossing the Rhine. German soldiers and officers alike were stunned. Reports captured by U.S. intelligence described enemy disbelief. They lose tanks daily, yet their formations remain unchanged. Their war machine does not slow. This superiority in recovery and repair was not just a tactical advantage. It shaped strategy at the operational level. Commanders could plan attacks with confidence, knowing that losses could be mitigated through rapid restoration. Sherman crews in turn fought with renewed morale, aware that if their vehicle was damaged, it would not be abandoned. This symbiosis between frontline combat and rear echelon support created a dynamic unseen in most armies of the time: post-war assessments. After Germany's surrender, military analysts studied these operations meticulously. The U.S. Ordnance Corps' performance became a case study in industrialized warfare. Reports emphasized that repair speed and operational readiness had directly influenced the outcome of campaigns in France, Belgium, and Germany. In particular, the Ardennes offensive highlighted the Americans' resilience under extreme adversity: freezing temperatures, poor infrastructure, and a determined enemy. Former German commanders, interviewed after the war, repeatedly cited the Americans' repair capabilities as a decisive factor. General Hasso von Manteuffel noted in his memoirs, "Our tanks were destroyed by superior numbers, yes, but more profoundly, by the Americans' ability to resurrect what we thought was gone. Their war machine could absorb loss as though it were invincible. It was not just the quantity of tanks that mattered, but the tempo of their return to battle. German forces, even when tactically skilled, could not counter an opponent whose strength replenished itself faster than it could be diminished." This insight influenced post-war armored doctrine worldwide. NATO nations incorporated mobile repair units, recovery vehicles, and integrated maintenance into armored formations, ensuring that lessons from Normandy and the Ardennes would guide strategy for decades. Psychological and strategic shifts beyond numbers and logistics. The rapid repair system exerted a profound psychological effect. The Germans had long believed in the superiority of their tanks and the invincibility of their mechanized divisions. Repeatedly witnessing damaged Shermans return to battle shattered this perception. German officers began to factor in not only Allied firepower, but also the resilience of the Allied support system. The inability to permanently neutralize American armor created uncertainty, eroding morale at both the tactical and operational levels. On the American side, this system fostered confidence. Tank crews trusted their maintenance teams implicitly. Soldiers knew that a disabled vehicle was not a death sentence. Mechanics would find a way to bring it back. This trust reinforced cohesion and fighting spirit, turning repair operations into an intangible weapon that complemented guns and artillery. By war's end, the metric of success extended beyond tanks destroyed or territory gained. Victory belonged as much to the men who never fired a shot, but whose hammers, welders, and wrenches restored the Army's backbone. The U.S. Army's capacity to regenerate combat power faster than the enemy could deplete it had shifted the very calculus of modern warfare. Enduring legacy the WWII. Effectiveness of the repair and recovery network left a lasting mark. The Americans had demonstrated that in mechanized warfare, the front line is only as strong as the system supporting it. Modern military theory increasingly emphasized logistics, recovery, and rapid maintenance as decisive factors in operational planning. The success of U.S. armored units in World War II became a blueprint for post-war armies worldwide. In essence, the Americans had redefined the terms of armored combat. They had shown that wars are not only won by superior firepower or numbers, but by resilience, efficiency, and the ability to restore what has been broken. Every Sherman rebuilt, every engine replaced, and every transmission restored carried the same weight as a gun fired at the enemy. And as the final Allied columns moved across the shattered heart of Germany in April 1945, this silent, relentless force, the men and machines behind the lines, ensured that victory was not only achieved, but sustained. The Ardennes, Normandy, and the push to the Rhine had all proven a single, undeniable fact. In the war of machines, it wasn't just destruction that decided the outcome. It was the power to bring back to life what the enemy thought was lost. The story of America's armored recovery system is not just a tale of machines. It is a testament to human ingenuity, endurance, and foresight. Across the battlefields of Europe, it was easy to notice the roaring engines of Shermans, the flashing cannons, and the explosions that marked every advance. But the quiet hum of welding torches, the creak of winches hauling tanks from craters, and the tireless hands of mechanics working through mud and snow were equally decisive. In war, destruction is immediate and visible. The roar of a gun or the collapse of a building signals action, victory or loss. But repair is invisible, slow, and often overlooked. Yet it shapes the rhythm of battle, the morale of soldiers, and the sustainability of campaigns. The Germans could destroy tanks, but they could not destroy the system that resurrected them. That system, a fusion of technology, planning, and human will, became a weapon in its own right. Beyond statistics and strategy, there is a deeper lesson. Resilience often outweighs raw strength. The Americans demonstrated that victory does not depend solely on the most advanced designs, the heaviest armor, or the deadliest guns. It depends on the ability to endure, to adapt, and to restore what has been broken. A battlefield machine is only as effective as the support that keeps it moving, the people who refuse to let it die, and the infrastructure that turns loss into renewal. By the end of World War II, German commanders understood a painful truth. In the fight against an army that could repair its own, destruction alone was insufficient. The Allies' triumph was built as much in workshops, garages, and muddy fields, behind the front lines as it was in forests, villages, and cities under fire. This quiet, relentless power, the ability to recover, rebuild, and return stronger than before, remains one of the most profound contributions to military history. It reminds us that in both war and life, resilience is the ultimate weapon.